Imagine standing on an island so small you can drive around the entire country in 20 minutes. The roads are cracked. The buildings are rotting. There's a rusted ship beached on the shore that's been there for decades. You check the history books and you discover something impossible. 40 years ago, the people standing on this exact spot were the second richest human beings on the planet. Richer than Americans. Richer than Europeans. Richer than oil sheikhs in the Middle East. But today, this place makes Detroit look like Dubai. You're not in a war zone. You're not in a failed state. You're in the Republic of Nauru, an 8-square-mile speck of coral in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that went from paradise to bankruptcy in a single generation. How does the second wealthiest nation per capita on Earth lose everything? Why did Australians once vacation here like it was Monaco? And why is this tiny island now so desperate that it rents itself out as a floating prison? Buckle up. We're about to excavate the bones of the only country in the world that literally mined itself to death. This is the tragedy of Nauru. Let's start with what's left. Because in Nauru, what's missing tells you more than what's there. The population today is around 12,000 people. But here's the thing, 90% of them are unemployed. Not underemployed. Unemployed. The official government employment rate hovers around 10%. Think about that. 9 out of 10 people on this island wake up with nothing to do and nowhere to go. There's no economy. There are no exports except one, and we'll get to that nightmare. There's one hospital that barely functions. One airport that sees maybe 3 flights a week. The center of the island? It's a lunar landscape. A toxic, hollowed-out wasteland of jagged limestone pinnacles where nothing grows. It looks like the surface of an alien planet. And yet, if you walk into the government offices, you'll still see traces of the Golden Age. Old photographs on cracked walls. Pictures of men in suits shaking hands with diplomats. Nauru once had an office building in Melbourne. They owned hotels in Guam. They had investments in London real estate and Broadway musicals. Now, the government can't afford to fix the streetlights. So how did they go from buying skyscrapers to selling their soul? To understand that, we need to go back to when Nauru wasn't a country. It was a gold mine. Except the gold was bird shit. Most people don't know this, but for most of the 19th century, the most valuable commodity in the world wasn't oil or diamonds. It was guano. That's the fancy word for bird poop. Why? Because it's basically pure nitrogen, and nitrogen makes plants grow like crazy. Before synthetic fertilizer, if you wanted to feed a growing population, you needed guano. And the Pacific Ocean had millions of seabirds who had been pooping on the same islands for thousands of years. Nauru was one of those islands. When European colonizers discovered it in the 1890s, they realized the entire island was sitting on a mountain of phosphate rock, fossilized bird droppings compressed over millennia. It was 80% phosphate, the purest, richest deposit anyone had ever seen. The British and Germans didn't care about the Nauruan people. They cared about the rocks. So they started digging. They ripped up the jungle. They carved out the interior of the island. And they shipped the phosphate to Australia and New Zealand to fertilize their farms. The Nauruans? They got nothing. They were forced to work in the mines or pushed to the edges of their own island. But then something changed. In 1968, Nauru gained independence. And in one of history's greatest Uno reverse cards, the Nauruan government said, "Actually, those are our rocks. And we're keeping the money now." Suddenly, the miners became the mine owners. And that's when everything went insane. Let's talk about the 1970s and 80s in Nauru. Because for about 20 years, this place was rolling in cash. At its peak, Nauru had the second highest GDP per capita in the world, right behind Saudi Arabia. Every citizen received free healthcare, free education, free housing. The government paid for everything. There were no taxes. None. You literally got paid just for being Nauruan. If you wanted to study abroad, the government gave you a scholarship. If you wanted a car, they subsidized it. If you wanted to fly to Australia for the weekend, the national airline, yes, they had their own airline, flew you there in style. Nauru bought a 52-story office building in Melbourne called Nauru House. They invested in luxury hotels, real estate across the Pacific, and even funded a failed West End musical in London about Leonardo da Vinci. Yes, really. They were living like kings. But here's the problem with being rich from a non-renewable resource. Eventually, you run out. And Nauru didn't just run out. They destroyed their entire country in the process. By the 1990s, 80% of the island had been strip-mined. The lush tropical interior was gone, replaced by a nightmarish maze of sharp coral pillars. You can't farm it. You can't build on it. You can't even walk through it without risking a broken leg. They had mined the island to death. And the money? Gone. So where did all the money go? This is where the story gets darker. Because Nauru didn't just lose its wealth. It was scammed, embezzled, and gambled away. The government created the Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust, a sovereign wealth fund meant to sustain the country forever. At its peak, it was worth over $1 billion. That's insane for a country of 10,000 people. But instead of investing wisely, they made some of the dumbest financial decisions in history. They invested in a coconut plantation in the Philippines that failed. They bought into a failed luxury resort in Fiji. They funded that Leonardo da Vinci musical that bombed. Corrupt officials allegedly siphoned millions into offshore accounts. By the early 2000s, the trust fund was empty. Bankrupt. The money was just gone. The phosphate was gone. The investments were gone. And Nauru was left with nothing but a hollowed-out island and a population that had never been taught how to do anything except cash government checks. Unemployment skyrocketed. Diabetes and obesity rates became among the highest in the world because the only affordable food was imported junk. The national airline collapsed. The infrastructure crumbled. Nauru had become a failed state. But unlike most failed states, they had no war, no dictatorship, no external invasion. They just spent all their money. And that's when Australia came knocking with an offer Nauru couldn't refuse. In the early 2000s, Australia had a political problem. Refugees were arriving by boat, seeking asylum. The Australian government didn't want to process them on Australian soil because of legal obligations. So they needed somewhere else to put them. Enter Nauru. In 2001, Australia struck a deal. They would pay Nauru millions of dollars a year to host a detention center for asylum seekers. Nauru, desperate for cash, said yes. This is the Pacific solution. Refugees, men, women, children, are intercepted at sea and sent to Nauru, where they're held indefinitely in camps while their asylum claims are processed. Some have been there for years. A decade even. Human rights groups call it a humanitarian disaster. Reports of abuse, suicide attempts, mental breakdowns. But for Nauru, it's the only income they have. Australian aid money makes up a huge chunk of the national budget. So now, Nauru's entire economy depends on being a prison island. They rent out their sovereignty, their land, their dignity. It's the final tragic evolution of the Nauruan economy. From mining bird shit to mining themselves to renting out their island as a cage. Let's talk about what the mining actually did. If you look at Nauru from space, you can see it clearly. A thin green ring around the coast and a dead gray center. That center is called topside, and it's one of the most alien landscapes on Earth. Thousands of limestone pillars, 10 to 15 feet tall, sharp as knives, packed together like a forest made of stone. Nothing grows there. No birds nest there. It's a biological dead zone. The rain that falls on topside doesn't create rivers. It just pools in toxic, stagnant ponds because the natural drainage is destroyed. The soil is gone. The topsoil that took millennia to form was scraped away and shipped to Australia. And it's not coming back. Rehabilitation efforts have failed because there's no soil to plant in, and importing enough soil to cover 80% of an island is impossibly expensive. Nauru isn't just economically dead. It's ecologically dead. Here's what happens when an entire society is built on free money and then the money disappears. Diabetes epidemic. Over 30% of the population has type 2 diabetes, one of the highest rates on Earth. Why? Because for decades, people ate imported processed food paid for by the government. Fresh vegetables. Too expensive. fishing and farming, forgotten skills, obesity crisis. Nauru has the highest obesity rate in the world. Not because people are lazy, but because cheap imported rice and canned meat replaced traditional diets. Lost generation. An entire generation grew up never having to work. Now there are no jobs, and no one knows how to create them. There's no entrepreneurial culture. No industry. No plan. The social fabric has unraveled. This isn't just economic collapse. It's cultural erasure. But wait, there's one more twist. In recent years, Nauru has become a pawn in the great game between China and the West. Taiwan used to have diplomatic relations with Nauru. But in 2024, Nauru suddenly switched recognition to China. Why? Because China offered financial aid. Lots of it. Now Nauru votes with China at the UN. They support Chinese positions on human rights. In exchange, China funds infrastructure projects and keeps the government afloat. Nauru has no choice. When you're broke, you take money from whoever offers it, even if it means becoming a geopolitical chess piece. So what's the moral of Nauru? It's this: wealth without wisdom is just a countdown to collapse. Nauru had everything. They had resources. They had money. They had a chance to build a sustainable future. But they made every mistake. They didn't diversify the economy. They didn't invest in education and skills. They didn't plan for the resource running out. They didn't protect the environment. They trusted the wrong people with their money. And now, 2 generations later, they're living in the ruins of their grandparents' wealth. Luxembourg pivoted from steel to banking to space. Nauru mined itself into oblivion. It's the ultimate cautionary tale. A reminder that natural resources aren't a blessing unless you know what to do with them. Otherwise, they're just a curse on a timer. Nauru is still there. The people are still there. But the country they once knew is gone. They can't mine anymore. They can't go back. The only thing they have left is the ocean around them and the hope that maybe, somehow, the world will remember them as more than a cautionary tale. If you walk the coast today, you'll still see old Nauruans who remember the Golden Age. They'll tell you stories about flying to Sydney on a whim, about government checks that never stopped, about a time when they were richer than almost anyone on Earth. And then they'll look at the rusted detention center on the hill and the toxic wasteland in the middle of their island, and they'll say the same thing. We had everything, and we lost it all.